You can start.
Okay. Yeah, I can see the recording symbol now. So, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone to our seminar today. And as Marco just mentioned, the talk will be recorded, so feel free to turn on or off your camera should you wish. My name is Yunyi Liao, and I'm a PhD student at Loughborough University, and very happy to chair today's seminar, which is organized by the Loughborough University Nationalism Network and co-sponsored by the Leiden University Nationalism Network, the Nationalism Studies at Edinburgh University, and the Nationalism Studies program at the Central European University. And today we are very delighted to be able to welcome Professor Jon Fox, who is going to give us a talk entitled Everyday Nationhood Rewind. Jon is a sociologist in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. His main areas of research are in nationalism, racism, migration, and integration. With each topic, he is interested in the ways these ideas, processes, structures, and ideologies are reproduced by people in their everyday lives. While appreciating the important role politics, culture, and the economy play in shaping these things, Jon's research pays special attention to the ways they are also the practical accomplishments of people doing routine things. His research today has examined these issues around questions in the UK, Hungary, and Romania. And today, Jon will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open the virtual floor for the Q&A afterwards. And hopefully we'll finish within 1 hour, so by 4 p.m. the UK time. And yeah, and now I will hand it over to Jon, and we'll enjoy listening to your talk.
Thank you, Yunyi, and thank you, Marco, as well, for inviting me. And yeah, I'm glad to be here. I didn't think anyone was going to come. I mean, it's a Thursday afternoon on a warm day in England. Why are people here? I'm not sure. But anyhow, nice to see you, or your names at least, and some familiar names. Nice to see you, Penny. Hello, Mick, and everyone else. Yes, so Marco asked me to do this a few months ago, and of course I said no. But then he kind of, persuaded me to kind of just give a talk, slightly kind of a retrospective on the everyday nationalism scholarship. And this is something I haven't done before, and so I've been thinking about this, working on this, and I've come up with something. I've realized it's very subjective understanding of the everyday nationalism scholarship. So I'm going to give you my kind of take on this. I'm gonna kind of try to explain how we got to where we are. So where the everyday nationalism scholarship began, and then think about where it's been and some of the kind of key debates that have defined the scholarship over the years, and then move on to some of the directions that it's been taking in more recent years. So it's kind of retrospective. It is retrospective. It's very subjective as well. And so I want to keep the talk relatively short, maybe 30 or 35 minutes, and then open things up to discussions, because my version is going to be different than your version. So if you have any knowledge of everyday nationalism, then this is going to be something that you're going to have your own take on. So I begin with the kind of background, how we got here, and then move on to questions of some of the key debates that frame the scholarship in everyday nationalism. So I want to start with not how we got here, but as a kind of segue into the talk. I want to mention the article that Cynthia Miller-Idris and I published in 2008 called Everyday Nationhood, which I'm guessing is why Marco asked me to give this talk. So that's kind of my contribution to the scholarship on this topic. But that Everyday Nationhood article is by far not the beginning of the scholarship. It was just Cynthia and I giving a name to something that was kind of developing in other areas, and us trying to kind of put our name on it. It's a useful starting point though for thinking back about the sorts of things that we were picking up on, which really hadn't been named as that to that date, or not kind of in a kind of coherent way, at least. So there are a couple of things I want to talk about. First is the scholarship on nationalism that was starting to deal with these questions. And then that has to begin with Michael Billig's work on banal nationalism, which, as I understand it, was not intended to be a kind of a way to kick off a scholarship on everyday nationalism, but it certainly inspired a lot of people, myself included, who with interest in everyday nationalism to kind of understand what he was saying and the significance of that for people who had interests in everyday life. So that was a good 1995 is when Banal Nationalism was first published, and it still has to be recognized not only as a seminal work in its own right, but really it's the kind of Benedict Anderson of everyday nationalism studies, right? So I mean, it's I don't think you can read anything in everyday nationalism that doesn't start in the first paragraph by referencing Michael Billig's work, Banal Nationalism, which is interesting because the book, as Michael will tell you, is not focused on everyday life. It's not really even a kind of bottom-up perspective in an empirical sense. It's more of a top-down one in terms of thinking about the ideology of nationalism, how nationalist ideology works, and how it reproduces a kind of national common sense of the world, a kind of common sense so commonsensical that we don't take note of it, that it's not the flag being waved, it's the flag hanging limply that is the metaphor for how we kind of understand nationalism in everyday life. I think another important mention, early mention in the scholarship on nationalism. So when I say scholarship on nationalism, scholars who are engaging with questions of nationalism explicitly, is Tim Edensor's 2002 book, National Identity, Popular Culture, and Everyday Life, which I guess moves us a little bit closer to questions of everyday life. It's got it in the title, at least. So we're starting to kind of see that thing. But again, empirically or methodologically, it's not really moving into some of the more qualitative research developments that we see somewhat later. And against Michael Billig's interest in political ideologies, we see Tim working with questions of popular culture here. But again, looking at the work that popular culture is doing as a medium for the mass appeal of national identity. Also theoretically rich books. So again, these are books that kind of inspired me, that I was interested in reading and very much interested in at this time. And so, yeah, so those are sort of two kind of important works. A lesser known work, but I still, one that at least influenced me and I think deserves mention for a couple of reasons, is Jonathan Hearn's work on everyday nationalism, his early work on everyday nationalism. I mean, he's got a 2007 article called National Identity as Banal, Personal, and Embedded. And that's an important article in its own right. It's kind of setting out a conceptual framework that's trying to think about national identity in ways that resonate with the kind of everyday nationalism agenda. But that is also built, there's not so much of this work in that, the empirical work in that article, but the earlier stuff that Jonathan did, might have possibly with his PhD, I'm not sure, was an ethnography of the merger of the Bank of Scotland and the Halifax Bank, an English bank, and a kind of working with staff in those banks and trying to understand how national identity manifested in those sorts of everyday contexts. I think that's really important because that's the kind of, this is the first taste we get, or one of the first tastes we get of some of the more kind of social anthropological stuff where we're looking at the meaning making functions of nation in everyday life. We're getting a window into those sort of meaning making functions of nationalism in everyday life. So, okay, I could, obviously go on. I'm looking at who's here to see whose name I should be dropping, but it's, I mean, it could be so many different people who've contributed to the scholarship. But these are some of the most important, in my view, early contributors to the scholarship. And Jonathan's work, the social anthropological bit or approach that Jonathan developed with his work in Scotland, I think is important because it reminds us that there's a large body of anthropological scholarship that has been dealing with questions of everyday life and not nationalism so much per se, but lots of other different things. So this is stuff that they've been doing for ages, for generations, inserting themselves in the everyday lives of different populations so that they can gain a better understanding of how things work and function on the inside, so from the inside perspective. So again, they're not particularly interested in questions of nationalism, but they certainly, or they haven't been historically interested in going further back in questions of nationalism. It's more things like ethnicity and culture and religion and tradition and things like that. But they're interested in culture and how culture allows us to make sense of the world and or helps us to make sense of the world. And nationalism is certainly part of that. And so later generations of anthropologists, not later in the kind of contemporary sense, but starting from the beginning of the 20th century and moving forward, we have other anthropologists who are working on questions of nationalism, at least tangentially. So I think here of I don't know if anyone will know these people, but John Borneman's work on Berlin in the 1980s. Daphne Berdal worked in the eastern part of Germany following unification in the 1990s. And then the person who inspired me most, not just for her empirical focus on Romania, but because of the theoretical sophistication of her work, was Catherine Verdery's work. So she's done some absolutely brilliant work on Transylvania, on Romania, on nationalism, from an everyday perspective, both historically but also in contemporary times. It's not the only thing that she's focused on, but she's done brilliant work there. So there's, we're just reinventing the wheel for as far as anthropologists are concerned. I mean, there's nothing new that everyday nationalism is doing, except, nicking or pinching the methods from anthropological perspectives and applying them to this question of nationalism. So again, nothing new. There's a long, long trajectory for that kind of thing. And we can also, I should also think about, just one other name to mention here is Richard Jenkins, who's obviously contributed theoretically to how we think about these sorts of concepts, and then had a wonderful book a few years back called Being Danish, where he told us what it was to be Danish. So this again is very much in this kind of social anthropological vein of everyday nationalism. So there's a lot of stuff going on before we get to 2008, the Everyday Nationhood article, and the point is to just recognize this stuff. And there are many things that I'm not recognizing that I could be talking about. But the key thing here is that up until this time, up until about the late 2000s, we're not really, so the thing doesn't have a name. So we're not we're talking about banal nationalism, that's going on. But then there's this shift to the kind of question of everyday nationalism, and I think those things follow on, the different trajectories kind of intersecting and being engaged with from a similar set of scholars, and but it's not the thing that really kind of has a name. So that's the kind of thing that's the difference up until the kind of late 2000s or so. This is also the backdrop for the 2006 book that I worked on with Rogers Brubaker, Margit Fleischmidt, and Liana Granchea called Nationalist Politics and Everyday Ethnicity in a Transylvanian Town, which I think is an important book, not just because it has my name on it, but because I think it does start to kind of give this thing the name, as the title suggests. It's everyday ethnicity in the title, but a kind of coming closer to this question and marrying it with questions of nationalist politics. So what we see here is an interest in nationalism that is informed by a kind of anthropological sensibility, or at least takes its inspiration from different sorts of anthropological approaches. That anthropology comes in through the person of Margit, who's an anthropologist by training. Rogers and I were kind of wannabe anthropologists, but not anthropologists by training, but we certainly were inspired by a lot of the stuff that was happening in anthropology. And Liana was an ethnomethodologist, so she brings in a different perspective, which is to remind us that the book itself is actually methodologically and theoretically rather eclectic. So it's not an anthropological work, but it certainly is inspired by a lot of anthropology. So this was a book that was important because I think it asked one of the questions that would kind of help define the scholarship and or help kind of not define the scholarship, but help us think about the kind of questions that the scholarship was interested in years to come. And that was how nationalism works in the everyday lives of people. And so I think that's still one of the questions, or at least for me, that's one of the questions that I see as being central to the scholarship. I don't think that was Michael Billig's question. I don't think he was asking how does nationalism work. You can speak to this later if you'd like to, Mick. And I don't think it was Tim Edensor's questions, and I don't think it was the anthropologist question. So again, it's just kind of moving a little bit closer to kind of saying this is the question that the book was interested in. The question we were asking, how does nationalism work in everyday life, followed from our own kind of intellectual journey that got us to the book. So that goes back to the early 1990s with Roger's interest in nationalism, and he was doing some work on nationalism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and he was particularly interested in this kind of relationship between what he called this homeland nationalism on the one side, and then external minorities on the other, and then nationalizing states on the third side. So this kind of triadic nexus, as he called it, horrible name, but it was his name for this thing. This kind of interaction between these different sets of mostly state actors and political actors. So again, very much a kind of top-down approach to that. But is it about that time that our paths crossed? I was living in Hungary, he was visiting Hungary, and he asked me to do some research on nationalist politics or nationalist politicians in Romania, as I spoke Hungarian at the time, and there was a large Hungarian minority there. So I went off to Romania to interview most of the major politicians in the Hungarian party in Transylvania at that time, which was interesting on a number of levels, but also agonizingly boring on another level. I mean, it was just, for me, it was sort of a game changer. I mean, a colossal waste of time to hear the same bloody thing from everyone over and over and over. So just this kind of really standard rehearsed political discourse that had me scratching my head thinking, who could possibly care about any of this kind of stuff? And that's important. I mean, I think that was an unfair question. I think lots of people cared about it at that time, but I didn't. And so, but then it was the first kind of iteration, the first time where I was kind of asking myself the who cares question when it comes to nationalism, right? So here are these nationalist politicians, they're super invested in these sorts of questions, and you just have to think, oh my God, who could possibly care about this? So it wasn't a kind of intellectual question at that time. It was more of a frustration question, but it was still the kind of thing that is going to influence where I go subsequently with my own interests in the field. So anyhow, this gradually led to my PhD, and the who cares question was turned into a kind of bottom-up approach to looking at nationalism, also in Romania or in Transylvania, doing research, qualitative research, ethnographic research with university students, Hungarian and Romanian university students, and trying to kind of sort out how they made sense of things in national terms. And I could have also talked about social psychological approaches before, some of which were interested in questions of national identity, and that was something that I guess I was interested in at the time. But I was very much interested in not kind of asking questions about national identity. It wasn't that I had dabbled in this a little bit one summer in Romania, where I spent a summer in a village and interviewed a number of peasants there about their national identities, and discovered that if you ask a national identity question, you get a national identity answer, and it's not actually that interesting. So although there are lots of people doing very interesting stuff on national identity, Ruth Vodok and her colleagues have done stuff that is obviously very sophisticated from a critical discourse analysis perspective, but it wasn't the thing that I was interested in doing. I was more interested in the kind of observational versions, kind of listening, waiting, talking to people, and just seeing when and how this idea of the nation was manifesting in different dimensions of everyday life. So my PhD overlapped or preceded, but then overlapped a bit with the research for the book that we were working on. The PhD was finished in 2004, the book published in 2006. And I don't, so again, the book isn't really a claim to the scholarship on everyday nationalism, but it did have Roger's name on it. He had name recognition at the time, and I think it did draw some attention to the field. Not my thesis, no one read that. I didn't even read that, but the book certainly did. And I think it gave us a bit of a platform for defining the field as we saw it. Now you can go back and read the book. It's 500 pages. It's got lots of pretty pictures, and it's a really good book, actually. But you can also just read the Everyday Nationhood article, because that's the thing that moves on from the book and then says, okay, this is what the agenda is, or this is how Cynthia and I see that agenda. So and the article also gives the kind of raison d'etre for why we're embarking on this kind of everyday nationalism agenda. And there, I think it's important that we see ourselves in opposition to some of the more kind of conventional scholarship on nationalism. We see ourselves filling a gap that isn't being filled or hadn't been filled. And so, again, anthropologists were doing this, lots of people were doing this before, but they weren't positioning themselves against others. And given that Cynthia and I had started from this kind of perspective on nationalism, we were kind of seeing ourselves somewhat in distinction to prevailing perspectives on nationalism. So the Gellners and the Hobsbaums, the Andersons and the Broyles, people like that who um, who were contributing to scholarship on nationalism, very often historians. And so, even though there were, yeah, so the difference that we had is that we were trying to oppose or distinguish ourselves from these other people working in the field, and the distinction was that um, we were calling out the scholarship on nationalism for neglecting the perspective of the masses, as it were, the people in whose name nationalism claims to speak. And so we set out this agenda from getting at nationalism from the bottom up and the everyday practices of nationalism that contribute to its reproduction. So rather than just sort of assuming that people, I mean, it all made sense to everyone, right? So you read the scholarship on nationalism. We live in a world of nations. Look outside your window, look at anything, think about anything. It's Michael Billig's Banal nationalism again. So it resonates with our common sense. But we weren't asking the actual question of, how does that work? So how do we know that this stuff that's happening top down is having an effect on people or is impacting people in their everyday lives, is making people national. So anyhow, I think it was a clever move of ours to kind of put our name on this. But as I've said, we weren't pioneers in any respect. We were simply repackaging that kind of stuff that earlier folk were working on, and the anthropologists, the social anthropologists, all those sorts of people, and then somehow claiming it as our own, branding it as our own. Okay, so this is probably a kind of convenient place for me to kind of step back from that trajectory that got us to this and move on to a bit more about some of the debates or some of the questions I think that are at least important to me in the scholarship. And it's convenient because I mean things just get messier from here on out. So this is the point where I think the field starts to have an identity of itself as a field of studies. There are people like Marco, like Michael Skay, like other people who are coming along and doing stuff on nationalism. Um, and they're developing their own identity and their own approach within that field, but also seeing themselves, or Michael's not here, I don't think, but Marco, you can speak to this if you like, but sort of seeing themselves as working in this kind of everyday nationalism vein and contributing to the direction of that sort of scholarship. And that's good, but it does get messier in terms of trying to kind of define different sorts of things that are going on. So what I'll do then is kind of come back to some of the things that um, uh, that I think are important in defining some of the concerns of the scholarship on everyday nationalism. Yes, and again, as I said at the outset of the talk, this is a very subjective view of these things. If Marco were to give this talk, he would do it differently. If Michael Skay were to give this talk, he would do it differently. Anyone who works in scholarship would have a different take on it, which is why I'd like to leave some of this at least open to discussion. So I want to talk about two sorts of binaries that I think are useful for thinking about different approaches to nationalism. So two sorts of artificial binaries, but things that are still hermeneutically perhaps helpful to kind of think about how we ask questions in everyday nationalism. The first is the first binary is around this question of what question drives us in a research. What are the sorts of questions that we're asking? I think we can think of two main lines of inquiry in scholarship on everyday nationalism. The first is what I refer to as the kind of does it work question. So we've got nationalism out there, and that's what the scholarship on nationalism has told us. But we don't know how effective it is in making people national? So we can ask that question. We can look at that question, and we can explore that empirically, theoretically, other sorts of ways. This approach is common in the scholarship on nationalism because it's much of the question. It's the question that I was saying earlier, that much of the scholarship is left unanswered. It's kind of implied it, right? So we've got all those top-down perspectives out there, all those kind of macro historical approaches to the emergence of nationalism. We get things like the institutional forces, the schools, Gellner's factories, the families, and the religious institutions. We get the economic imperatives of nationalism, capitalism, modernization, development, but also consumerism and commodification. We get the political drivers of nationalism, so national policy, nationalist discourse, elite nationalism, those sorts of things. We get the cultural shapers of nationalism, so the museums and the music, the art and the food, but then also the kind of anthropological understanding of culture with a capital C, where it's about the kind of meaning-making function of culture. In all of these regards, we're looking at these sort of more macro analytical structures and forces that contribute to the production and the reproduction of nations. And making nations is supposedly about making people national. But it's that latter bit that's mostly missing from these top-down perspectives. So we get a theory about how people are made national, but we don't get the evidence for the ways in which that theory actually plays itself out. And that's the question, one of the questions that everyday nationalism asks. How does it work? Does it work? Does it work at all? So it just looks at the mechanics of that, kind of how these structural forces make us national. So we can ask questions like, do we imbibe the school curriculum, the history curriculum when we're sat in schools, the flag ceremonies, the hand on the heart, all that kind of stuff? Does that stuff work? And if so, what does working look like? So those are kind of questions that we ask. Does capitalism make us national? Are we consumers of nationalist commodities, or are class divides overcome by a kind of national unity, right? That's a kind of another question we can ask. Does nationalist politics resonate with us? A kind of classic question. Are we moved by the speeches, inspired by the national holiday commemorations? Do we engage in national debate? Those kinds of questions. And then do we care about our national culture? Do we visit the museums? And what do those visits mean to us? Do we listen to the music? Do we eat the national cuisine? We're back to the kind of cultural anthropological stuff. Are we making meaning with the nation in a more kind of banal way? Of course, questions like this aren't asked in such mechanical ways, but approaches following this line of inquiry are interested in the efficacy of nationalism. Here's this stuff, this is called nationalism, however we define it, and we're asking whether it works, or what its relevance is, what its meaning is, what its invocation is in everyday life. And a lot of national identity research asks these sorts of questions. There's a lot of stuff on performance. Michael Skay's work on ecstatic nationalism asks these sorts of questions, not just from the kind of design element of national holiday commemorations, but also from the consumption of it, how people engage with those sorts of things. Lots of other stuff as well. So that's one side of the binary, one side of the coin, which is the kind of top-down, does it work, trickle-down version of nationalism, everyday nationalism. The other side, I think, represents somewhat more of a epistemological break with these other approaches, in the sense that it just kind of brackets all that stuff up top, on top, and says, let's just approach things from a bottom-up perspective. This is the more kind of anthropological stuff on everyday nationalism. So it's not following a trickle-down logic, but rather a bottom-up one, how people are complicit in the production and the reproduction of nations in their everyday lives. So it's not people as consumers of nationalism, but it's people as producers of nationalism, or consumers and producers of nationalism. And here I think the everyday, at least for me, provides us with a kind of useful starting point for these inquiries, because it's, I mean, there's lots of theorization done about the everyday life, but I think the attractiveness of it for some people, including myself, is that it's just kind of like a tabula rasa, right? So there's loads of things that go on in everyday life, including, of course, everyday nationalism. But it doesn't have the same path dependency to nationalism that you find in other lines of inquiry that start from the top with nationalism and then ask the does it work stuff, but maybe missing other things that are going on in the margins and stuff and not connected to that. So bottom-up perspectives and contrasts follow from a more anthropological tradition and try to take everything in context, right? Try to understand things in context, not just the what of everyday nationalism, which the top-down stuff gets, but the when and the where of everyday nationalism as well. This is what Cynthia and I described in our 2008 paper methodologically as a kind of wait and listen approach, right? So it's not the kind of fishing expedition for nationalism, or if it is, it's more. If it is, it's not using nationalism as our bait or something. It's sitting next to a river and watching the fish go by. I mean, that's a really horrible analogy. Sorry. But it's waiting and listening and watching and observing to see and hear how and when the nation manifests in everyday life, and trying to understand it a little bit more in context, as opposed to going around and poking about for nationalism by asking people more direct questions about those things. So that's the kind of bottom-up perspective, in contrast to the more kind of does it work question. And it's the first binary that I wanted to kind of suggest, one kind of a sorting mechanism for thinking about different approaches. Of course, lots of approaches try to combine these different things, and the things that don't fit into that binary, but it's one of the ways that I've thought about everyday nationalism over the years. The second one is the binary between banal nationalism and everyday nationalism. This is something Ellie Knott presents in her work, and lots of people, including myself, have kind of played with this distinction a little bit. So just to go back to the banal side of things, nationalism is the kind of ordinary landscape of things, the kind of common sense as I described it earlier. There's been loads of stuff that's done in this tradition that doesn't reference everyday nationalism, but just kind of follows on from the work that Michael Billig has done with banal nationalism. So I think, again, Nick can speak to this if you would like to, but I think Michael sees his work as only ambiguously connected to this question of everyday nationalism. And my understanding from things both he has said and others have said about him is that he has a kind of somewhat ambivalent relationship with everyday nationalism. So it's not what he was trying to do. I don't think he has any objections to people being inspired by it, but those of us who are working in everyday nationalism have been inspired by the work that Billig has done, because it gives us a very powerful and convincing explanation for how nationalism works from this kind of perspective that he's laid out here. And the way it works, in his famous words, not mine, is it operates mindlessly rather than mindfully. So the measure of nationalism's success is not to be found in flags being waved, as I said earlier, but in flags being ignored. We don't pay it attention because we don't need to pay it attention. It's just there, right? It operates in the background, stealthily concocting a world of nations without requiring our attention, or really in a sense kind of wanting our attention, because any kind of attention that we give it is an opening for some sort of critical engagement with it. So it's just part of the way things are. This approach, I've argued, however, paints us, the consumers of nationalism, if we want to use that kind of crude language, as nationalist dupes, right? So we just kind of imbibe the nation on some level. So we just kind of take it all in, without really kind of engaging with it that critically. Against this, there's the other approach, which is the nationalism as practice bit, right? So this is the doing things with nationalism. This is the manipulating it, using it, molding it, shaping it discursively, cognitively, instrumentally, performing it, consuming it, lots and lots of other things, right? So this is us doing things with the nation as a practical accomplishment in everyday life. And so this is a more agentive kind of understanding of nationalism, where people are not just consumers of nationalism, but also producers of nationalism, right? So they're shaping the nation not simply in accordance with top-down, state-led kind of prescription or something like that, but in response to the contingencies of their everyday lives, the things going on in their lives. They're doing this in ways that matter to them. And this is really what Cynthia and I were trying to capture in our 2008 article, when we were talking about talking the nation and choosing the nation, performing the nation, consuming the nation, plenty of other things that wasn't ever meant to be a kind of exhaustive list, just a suggestive list of some of the things that we do with the nation. But it was always about us doing things. I don't know if there was a kind of self-consciousness there, but there was idea that we were doing things. We were agents of everyday nationalism. And so it centers people as these active agents of nationalism. So that's the second kind of binary with we have got the nationalist dupes on one side and the nationalist agents on the other side. Though I have to admit that I think this is a binary that may have some value or not hermeneutically, but I empirically, I mean, I think it's really difficult to disentangle these sorts of things, and so Billig's people are not dupes, and the people that I'm describing are not agents, that are not only agents, right? There's a lot of stuff that's kind of in between this, and I think of some of Rogers Brubaker's work on kind of cognitive approaches to nationalism as not things in the world but perspectives on the world, redolent of his interest in cognition. Where the nation is a kind of way of seeing the world. And I think that kind of gets at this thing where we can think about seeing the world and representing the world in very self-conscious, purposeful terms in our everyday lives, but we can equally see it as something that's completely unreflexive in a more kind of banal way. So I think the divide between those two sorts of things is not very clear, but it still may be useful to kind of ask questions or to think about how we approach our understanding of everyday nationalism. Anyhow, loads of ways to slice scholarship. Those are two of the ways I've thought about over the years. I'd like to just end very briefly, more briefly than I had intended, because I'm looking at the time here, and I'm right at about half an hour right now. So I just want to say a couple of things about where the scholarship has gone over the years and possibly about where it's headed, although I can't say where it's headed. It depends on where the world takes us. But where it's been, anyhow, in recent years, I think it's just followed where nationalism has taken us. So I think nationalism has changed quite significantly over the years. If you go back to the stuff that I was writing, more than a decade ago, I mean, this was stuff that was inspired by the changes that were sweeping across Eastern Europe in 1989 and the 1990s, the internecine conflict in Yugoslavia, the sub-state nationalism in the former Soviet Union, the reconfiguration of the political map along ethno-national lines, and the political legitimacy that nationalism gained throughout the region at the time. And these aren't the issues that define. Well, wait, I guess they are. I mean, Ukraine, yeah. So maybe to a certain extent they are, but nationalism has kind of transformed itself, and it's changed, and along with that, our understandings, our interest in everyday nationalism have also changed. So there are lots of trajectories that could take. I just want to mention very briefly two of them that I think are particularly interesting, neither of which I do any or do much work in, a little bit kind of tangentially. But anyhow, the one is the question of immigration and sometimes the racism that kind of gets implicated in nationalism. I mean, I think we're seeing a kind of more supercharged version of nationalism and everyday nationalism in the world that we live in today. So we've got this always existing dark underbelly of nationalism with racism, and that's kind of been coming out of the shadows, I think, in recent years with the rise of the far right, with populism, xenophobia. And here again, most of the stuff that we're reading in the scholarship, I think, is typically, looking at this from a political perspective, a more kind of top-down perspective, where we're looking at political parties, party politics, but particularly with the far right and things like that. But there's also a lot of really interesting stuff that looks at similar questions from the bottom up, and that includes things like Charles Letty Owen's work on everyday nationalism in England related to questions of immigration, things like that. So there's racism that kind of comes up there, but it's not the kind of focus of what he's working on. But probably most important, I think, is Marco's stuff. I mean, Marco has been doing this for ages now, looking at questions of this intersection of nationalism and immigration. And, I remember when he first started doing that, I'm thinking like, well, why are you doing that, Marco? And well, now I see why I was a bit slow to kind of catch on, but I understand that now, and I think I think he got a jump on this at a time when other people weren't really doing this. So this is the nationalism question. I mean, if the question that defined the scholarship and the in its early history was, peasants into Frenchmen. So how do we turn peasants into Frenchmen? So Eugene Weber's book. I think it's now about turning immigrants into nationals, and that's the kind of empirical question of nationalism. One that's always unsuccessful, just like turning peasants into Frenchmen was largely unsuccessful. But it's still the kind of focus of nationalism, of nationalism in the world today. So we've followed that focus, and people like Marco have led the way in following that focus. So the second thing I want to mention just very briefly, because I know even less about it, is the digital aspect of nationalism. And I'm thinking here of Sabina Mihai's work, another Loughborough alumna, who's done stuff on this. But there are too many things. I mean, I have a PhD student who's working on this right now, and like everything else, I learned from my PhD students about these sorts of things. So I know this kind of, from her about the things that she's doing here, and it's a very quickly expanding scholarship. And again, something very important in terms of a development. I mean, it was something that raises all sorts of interesting questions about everyday nationalism, as we now have this kind of virtual platform to share our views with people, to identify ourselves, to mobilize, to do things with nationalism, or just to do it in a more banal way, to consume the litany of national symbols and national objects that are circulated through social media, through other sorts of things, or to make national choices in terms of who we friend on Facebook or who we friend on social media, these sorts of things, and who we follow, and it's sort of implicitly making these kinds of choices. So I think it's a really interesting and important way to kind of think about the future of everyday nationalism and its virtual domains. Anyhow, lots of other things I could talk about. I've already spoken too long. So I guess my point at the end is simply that our everyday lives dictate where the scholarship of everyday nationalism is going to go. If you want to understand everyday nationalism, we need to begin with what's going on in our everyday lives. So I will stop there and open the floor to questions or just discussion or other ideas or whatever you'd like to do.
Thank you, John, for your talk. Really interesting, and we really enjoy listening to it. And we've learned a lot about the story behind the theory of everyday nationhood. And now we are opening for questions. So feel free to turn on your microphones and ask questions, or you can type your questions in the chat box, and I'll help read it. Give some time to the audience. Maybe they're still digesting it. Oh, Michael. Michael. I see your hands up, so perhaps you can go first.
Yeah. I feel that the line is very disturbed, but hopefully you can hear. Thank you very much, John. Honestly, I mean, as an organizer of this event, I was expecting tons of questions. I'm surprised why we have 28 people in the room, and it seems that what you say was taken without any question. I mean, it would be also, I don't want obviously to ask Mick, but you mentioned Mick so many times, and you also mentioned Mick as a father somehow of everyday nation. So it would be interesting maybe if he has anything to say around that. But maybe pick up on the questions that you mentioned when you were just taking stock of the kind of questions that are on the ground that you were mentioning. On the one hand, you do have the question of people as consumers somehow trickle down, that what you were saying. And then the other question about people as producers. And I wonder whether you have anything that you have to reflect on how to link the two, because obviously the kind of nation which is present in this trickle down is somehow a nation which already exists, and people just, it percolates down and that's it. Whether they take it or they deflect it, but the nation exists as in the way it has been created through those macro institutional perspectives. But for me, obviously, it's very interesting, the second one, what people make of the nation, and what are the chances in that instance to somehow challenge, reconfigure, rewrite, reimagine the nation. And I know there is no answer, but it's interesting to see that the tension between the two. On the one hand, as consumers, they reproduce what is already available, but the potential that exists. And as you rightly mentioned, I'm trying to unpack, as obviously Anthony Smith did with the critique to your own piece, the people, because as you rightly suggested, obviously the people now is not homogeneous, has never been homogeneous, but now the ethno-racial composition is very much present, and those kind of people that have different ethno-racial lines compared to the majority might have different ways of reproducing, engaging, reimagining the nation. So what is the space in there to engage with that? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. Yeah, so it's interesting hearing your binaries kind of fed back to you, because you immediately see how brittle they are, but I think, you know, I still think it's useful just to kind of give some coherence to things, to kind of think about some artificial oppositions that still help us think through some of these things and approach them in a more critical way, as I think you're doing in your question. So in terms of the kind of relationship between consumption and production, I mean, you know, it's useful to kind of think in those terms sometimes, but I think from the everyday perspective, I just think they often get blurred. I think that the act of consumption itself is an act of producing meaning, so it's an act of production as well, right? So when we you know, if you look at the kind of more anthropological scholarship on questions of consumption, this is about, you know, how we align ourselves with the world, how we define ourselves in the world that we live in, the social significance of the things that we consume, and how we project that to others. So there's obviously a productive element in there as well. The production binary, I think, is useful in just thinking about the overall architecture of the way in which everyday nationalism sees itself more in this kind of bottom-up things, but bottom-up, top-down, consumption, production, elites, non-elites, all these things are, you know, they don't go very far in terms of offering much explanatory power. I mean, they give us a starting point for thinking about the things that we're interested in, but it's really hard to kind of, you know, disentangle these things in practice. And so when you talk about different understandings of the nation in a complex world, yeah, you know, there is you know, everyday life is not hermeneutically sealed from other domains of life. Everyday life isn't even a domain. It's not. It's just a concept for thinking about, you know, things in relation to things that aren't everyday life. So it's difficult to kind of disentangle these things.
Sorry, just realized I'm on mute. Thank you for John's comment on Marco's question. And do we still have any other questions? Perhaps you can just unmute yourself and then. Oh, Michael.
Yes,
please.
Have I unmuted myself? Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I found this a wonderful talk, and I feel I've learnt a lot. And I just want to make a couple of comments, because you've made some generous comments about a book I wrote 25 years ago, or slightly more. That just because I wrote top down doesn't mean that I believe that's the way to do things. It just happened to do that, and I haven't followed the material on nationalism since. and a lot of very perceptive work has been done since, and I see no reason to defend what I've done or say what I did is better than what is being done at all. What I would say is that one of my motives for writing that book was I felt that both politically and intellectually at that time nationalism was being underestimated, and there particularly were from European theorists a belief that nationalism was dying out and we were going into a global world, and I felt that was naive and wrong. But as academics, we always like to be right, but I must say I wish I had been right. When I read what's coming out of the Ukraine, it is absolutely awful. I just wish we were in a different world, but I can't see how we can progress to the world which would transcend the awfulness of certain forms of nationalism. Now, I don't know if you can comment on that, Jon.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much, Mick. I kind of like to hear your comments on that. I mean, so you said that you wrote Banal Nationalism at a time when you think it was being underestimated, or nationalism was being underestimated, and there was perhaps a false optimism about a kind of move to a more globalized sensibility or world or something like that, where nationalism had lost its relevance. And so you seem to be implying that with Ukraine now and perhaps other developments that nationalism's relevance is front and center. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, yeah, and I think even at the time that I was doing work in Eastern Europe in the 1990s and 2000s, I mean, I was interested in nationalism and had my kind of ear cocked to things that were going on that were about nationalism and stuff, but I don't think it had the same kind of dominance that it has now, and Ukraine is certainly part of that, but also other things going on in the world, as I mentioned in the talk, the rise of populism and other kinds of things. So yes, I guess the contrast is or the reference point is kind of hot nationalism versus banal nationalism, which I don't think again was ever intended as a kind of strict binary, but just to recognize that there are degrees of heat and degrees of banality that operate side by side. But it seems like things have heated up on the hot side, and I'm just as dismayed as you or as anyone by what's happened in Ukraine. Yeah, certainly.
Yes.
And we have another hand from Penna Jota.
Yeah.
If I pronounce your name correctly.
That's fine. It's a very good pronunciation, actually. Everyone on the call probably knows me as Penny, so feel free to call me that. I mean, Jon, it's always a pleasure. I think I traveled back about nearly 10 years ago when I was your student, but it's always nice to hear you talk. I suppose I have two questions that are more forward-looking in a way. The first one is a comment followed by a question. So as I hear you talking, about the stuff you used to do 10 years ago and how things are now in terms of where nationalism research lies, I can't keep wondering. I mean, in a way, there is much more stuff done on nationalism. And as Michael said, nationalism is becoming increasingly prominent, even in terms of discourse within, common people, never mind academics. So would you say people are becoming more inventive in terms of performing nationalism? Or, you know, what repercussions does this have for someone researching nationalism? Are your subjects more, you know, suspicious of you as a researcher, so they mask better what they could, or is this an entirely new repertoire in terms of how people produce nationalism or consume nationalism, or do both, depending on what aspect you look at it? And then the second question is, you've done what you've done. What is your future project or ideal project now? What would you like to do?
Oh, am I muted? Can you hear me, Penny? Oh, good. I wasn't muted the whole time. Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Can you repeat the second question, because you cut out just I didn't hear the second bit of the second question.
Yeah. So the second bit, can you hear me now?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second bit was, what would be your ideal next project be in terms of nationalism?
Right. Yeah. Right. I have no idea. But let me go to the first question, which is the question about people kind of being more inventive. Is that right? So kind of nationalism evolving in such a way that compels us to be a bit more inventive. I mean, by that, I mean, I sort of understand that as suggesting that, you know, kind of, and this is what scholars of nationalism are struggling with, are, you know, what are we witnessing in the world? Is it nationalism? Is it not nationalism? I think nationalism is, if it is a thing, if it is the term that we want to use, it is being redefined and used and repurposed and reconfigured and all those kinds of things. But I don't know if that suggests an inventiveness I think that's more, the inventiveness is people who invested their lives in studying nationalism need to be inventive and kind of claiming this as nationalism. So it's people like me that, you know, try to sort of see if I can square the circle. Although I haven't been really involved in these kinds of debates, but I think in terms of what people are doing, it doesn't matter to them what it's called. I mean, I think the question, you know, so I don't think there is an inventiveness. I think it's, or no more, just, I mean, there's inventiveness in the sense that there always is. I don't think the relative inventiveness has increased. I mean, I think it goes back to some of this kind of more anthropological stuff, that is this a useful way of making sense of the world around me? Is that relevant? And developments in the world are giving relevance to the war in Ukraine, as Mick mentioned, but populism, racism, all the immigration, all these sorts of things are operating on some level, either explicitly or implicitly, with national categories, and they're making it relevant. And so the people are seeing things, or people are or can see things, or are invited to see things in these sorts of ways. And so I think that's I don't think that's, you know, I don't think anyone's I don't think most people are invested in everyday life and sort of thinking, okay, how can I reconcoct the nation so that it will do this or that? It's just, you know, is it useful or is it not? And I mean, that's a crude way of kind of thinking about it, but the inventiveness is in the kind of, you know, creation of things, but not as an innovation, an intentional innovation, but just something that reflects people's circumstances. On the second question, my ideal next project, I don't know. You need to come up with something for me, Penny, and tell me what it is. I'm at the end of another project right now, so I will be thinking about that soon, but I haven't quite got there. Thanks for asking, though.
Thank you both. And I think we only have time for one quick last question from Krasniki, if I pronounce your name correctly.
Yeah,
so keep it short, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Thanks a lot for a great overview, and always a pleasure. So just a quick question about, I mean, you were talking about the binaries, and so I want to ask something about a different binary, the binary between the online and the offline. So of course you don't do a lot of work on the kind of online everyday nationalism, but my question has two parts. The first one is methodological. So is digital ethnography the only or the best method to study the everyday online? again, I guess Sabine and other people who are doing work on digital nationalism would be more, I guess, more prepared to answer that question. But also the second one is like, I think a lot of people are kind of hinting to the fact that because of the widespread use of digital technologies, the people have a much higher and more proactive role in the making and remaking and the imaginary of nationhood online. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, thanks, Pratik. Those are good questions. I won't have good answers to. They deserve better answers. But I mean, on the latter one, which is a little bit easier, I guess that is kind of my thinking, that it just gives it gives the illusion of democratization of nationalism, that people can, see themselves as producers. I don't think it produces the reality of that kind of democratization, but it certainly makes people feel, or it has the potential to make people feel more able to engage, to put things out there in a way that, you have this invisible audience of millions of people who aren't interested in anything you say, but there's still this kind of audience that you couldn't have imagined, a couple generations ago when you're sitting in the pub talking to four of your mates, so that's a very tangible audience. But social media has this imaginary that, you can be engaging with people, and sometimes, some of those ideas do stick, and there are people who receive them, influencers or whatever, I don't know, but I think there is that kind of thing. That's one of the things that would seem relevant to me, although I haven't done any research on this topic. On the more methodological point about digital ethnography, and just even, the more fundamental point about the binary between the online and the offline. I was the one who started with binaries, so you're right to throw them back at me. But yeah, I mean, there are people who have dealt with exactly these sorts of questions, and like any binary, it's a false one. But how to think about it and how to approach it, I mean, I guess the methodological thing is the digital world is as big as the offline world, so it always depends on what sorts of questions you're asking, and whether digital ethnography is the right methods depends on what you're trying to uncover in the world, or just understand in the world. So that's not a very good question, but talk to Sabina about it. I'm sure she'll have good answers, and lots of people. I mean, it's something that interests me. I'd like to delve into a bit more. I don't know if it's the next project that Penny's talking about, but it is something that I am interested in. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm muted again. Thank you all, and feel free to continue the discussion outside of the meeting, and we'll need to leave. Let John leave now because he will need to walk his dog. Yeah, so thank you, John, again for this interesting talk, and we've learned a lot today. And also thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today, and we hope to see you all in our next event in the future. And so thank you, and see you, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.